question of writing the real India. The panelists for this session include Mr. Prajwal Parajuly, who is an author whose works have focused largely on Nepali speaking people and their culture. His first book, The Gurkha's Daughter Stories, described and dramatized the experiences of the Nepalese people and the Nepalese diaspora. It was also shortlisted for the 2013 Dylan Thomas Prize. Sumana Roy is an author and a poet. Her latest book, Missing, has been shortlisted for the Prabha Kaithan Women's Voice Award. The session will be moderated by Kota Neelima, who is an author, columnist, artist, and political commentator. Her latest publication is a non-fiction work by the Oxford University Press called Widows of Vidarbha, Making of Shadows, which was released in 2018. Unfortunately, the fourth panelist who was supposed to join us for this session, Mr. Siddhartha Sarma, was unable to come because of problems with his flight scheduling. For further information on our panelists, please do visit our website www.aklf.in. I will now hand over the proceedings to our moderator, Kota Neelima.
Good afternoon. It's a wonderful afternoon here in the winters, the best part apparently of Calcutta I've heard, the winter time, which makes you actually introspect a lot about things which perhaps we don't focus on so much. And I'm glad that we have a panel here to discuss something, one of those things which we don't really think about that much. What is real India? I mean, we have a concept of India which has been given to us. And the real India, the writing about real India, is always going to be a challenge because where do you find this real India? It's in the shadows of this concept which we have been given. And I say this from my experience of writing about rural India and farmer suicides and rural distress, that these issues, these people do not figure in this idea of India which we have been given, we have been sold in a way. So I would say that this concept is exclusivist. It excludes, because to be able to have a power over a territory or a people, you have to homogenize that population. People with similar cultures, people with similar choices, people with similarities of community, caste. The mainstream has to be protected from differences, from diversity, from authenticity, in other words. So the question would be that when we are writing about, or when we talk about the real India, what does it really mean? Where does it really exist? So one of the things which I feel is that these lines which those who seek to rule, the lines which they draw, are not drawn on paper. They're not imaginary lines at all. They're drawn between people. That's how power is exercised. These lines are also not, the idea is to impose these lines, these divisions in the minds of people. But that doesn't happen, does it really? Because the mind is intrinsically free. Now, how do we know this? Because there is conflict. We know that the mind is free because there is conflict. There is conflict against rules which infringe on freedom, rules that stereotype women based on caste, rules which impose divisions based on class, communities, religions. The fight against these shows that intrinsically we do not believe in these rules. Now, if you ask those, and I have done that, if you ask those who have the power to make these rules, that why do we need these rules? And they would say, people won't know what to do if we didn't have the rules. There would be anarchy. They would say, the people won't know what to do with freedom if they got it. But I beg to differ. Because I think people have dreamt of that kind of freedom for an eternity. The conceptualization of power, I believe, has been generated through articulation. And that's what should be done with the conceptualization of freedom. And that's where our panel comes here into play great authors, two very celebrated young authors who have reconceptualized freedom in a different way, in, in a constant way. Um, one of the things which I notice about both their works is the closeness with nature. And that's something which I find resonance with my own work because especially in rural India, there are few questions which I have asked several times. I think I must have asked 100 times why farmers commit suicide. I've asked 100 times what happens to the farmer's widow when the farmers commit suicide. The widow has asked 100 times what happens to her children. Now, mind you, these questions are not asked to the state or the administration who actually owe an answer because they are the ones who can find a solution. These questions are asked among oneself in some dark, dusty corner of our country. But the other question which is constantly asked is why do farmers continue doing agriculture when it takes such a serious toll? And they have different answers. They say there are no options to agriculture. They say that they can't find jobs even if when they are educated. But they also tell you that they love the farm. That is why they stick to their lands. That's why they wait for the rains, even today when they are dependent on rains because the government has not provided infrastructure for irrigation. That's why they keep hoping to wake up one day to a better morning. So these are the stories which Sumana and Prajwal write are serious stories about the other India. They actually discover the other India in articulating it. There is a smell of earth about them, there is a feel of tears about them, but these are the real stories. So that's to give a brief context about the kind of discussion we're going to have here. I'll ask both the authors to read from their books and also discuss about their books. And in the end, if there is time, I'll try to read from my own, and we'll follow that up with questions and answers. To begin with Sumana, right? One of the things which comes to mind is about the missing woman in the book, or the missing wife, to be precise. So, what is it a very complex construct? Is it a very simple, a person missing? I mean, what's the big deal? But when a wife is missing, especially in a kind of Indian social context, is it a complex thing? What are the dynamics of it? Of course, we have one of the greatest epics of this country, Ramayana, based on this idea of the wife missing. So what is it like writing about it? This is the book, Missing. So would you tell us a little?
Thank you, Neelima, and a good afternoon to all of you. Uh, Before I answer my question, the question that you asked me about missing, I think I would like to say that when you introduce Prajwal and myself as belonging to the other India, I think both of us, and I'm hoping I'm speaking for Prajwal, this is not the other India for us. This is the only India we know. The other India, the self, because the self is the other, the opposite of the self is the other. So this is the only India we know, and we don't think of ourselves as the other. So we are writing about our realities. And even I think the phrase real India is slightly problematic. There are as many realities as there are people. About missing and the missing wife, the idea for this novel was triggered by a real life incident that took place in Guwahati in July 2012, when a young girl was molested in Guwahati, and people around her, which included journalists, instead of trying to help her, took videos that went viral. And you can find it on Twitter with the hashtag #GoHeartyGirl. At that time, a carpenter was making a bed in our house in Shiliguri. And it was the first time that I would encounter what would come to be known as fake news. The things that Bimolda, whose name I could not change, and he is Bimolda in the book as well, the things that he was telling me were very different from what I found on NDTV, CNN, IBN, or even social media. So the trigger for this was to record for myself, I did not know that it would take the form of a novel, was to record for myself the dissonance between what was being reported and what was perhaps actually happening. Bimolda, who had come from Bangladesh very early in the early 1950s, kept reminding me of the Bengali Hatao movement in the northeast of the 1970s, and he presumed that something similar was happening in Lower Assam, where there was a riot in Bodoland. The floods of Assam, which take place almost every monsoon every year. And then I began to think of how I could place characters in this. Only 3 characters in this novel have been invented. I've invented them, which is the blind poet, his wife who goes missing, and their son who's writing a PhD in England. Apart from that, all the other characters in this book are real, and most of these conversations are conversations that I have overheard. It just struck me that the woman, the blind poet's wife, the blind poet, you notice the conceit about the missing wife? It struck me one day when I had written almost 3 to 4 sections of what would become the novel, that our epics were based on the woman going missing, whether it was Sita or Helen of Troy. And so I wanted to investigate what it meant in the contemporary context. This immediately brought other analogies and parallels in my mind. The first of these was, it gave me a structure for the novel. The 7 adhyayas of the Ramayana became 7 days in the summer of 2012. The other thing was, where is Lanka now? And it suddenly, gives me goosebumps right now to think that the northeast is the Lanka of present day India. So these transpositions, they almost happen simultaneously. About the missing wife, yes, it's not just an intellectual, it's an emotional conceit too. So among the choices that I had, whether I wanted to call it missing or the missing, I thought the missing came from a very Anglophone tradition. Missing was, if you go to a police station and you see that board, it just says missing, and that is the word I wanted to hold.
Thank you. Thank you, Sumana. Talking about the other, which is an interesting point you make about the real and the other, and how sometimes even the real is not entirely the right word for what one is trying to write. And also the possibility that the moment you write about the other, does it mainstream it? So the moment when one is talking about the fringe, and at that time, which is not the mainstream, but the moment you talk about it, are you actually othering something else, whereas you are mainstreaming something else? So absolutely true. I think these are important entry points into a debate. To say that there is an otherness or there is a reality to something are just an entry point. I think there are so many avenues after that to explore, which is what I was talking about, the complexity of writing about India, which is where I want to talk to Prajwal, who has written extensively about the Nepalese diaspora. Is this how a nation is constructed? I mean, where we exclude, therefore identify by mainstreaming a kind of a section which can be generalized on something which is common, commonly shared, or even imposed?
Hi everyone. It's wonderful to be here with Sumana and Neelima. When we talk about potentially mainstreaming the other by way of fiction or our writings, I think that's a lot of pressure that I am not prepared to shoulder. I am not prepared to carry the burden of representing my community for a national readership, for an international readership. There's so much pressure. In the beginning, when I started my writing career in 2013, I was often introduced as a writer from the Northeast, which was an extremely limiting description of who I was. Yeah, I was a writer from the Northeast, but I was also a lot of other things. I am also a lot of other things. What's next now? Will they be introducing me as a male writer? But these days, I have sort of embraced the other, Sumana. I mean, I'm okay being a little different from quote unquote the heartland. I'm okay being this slightly isolated part of India. I think that's what makes us unique. That's what makes us beautiful. I think there is no city in the world as unique as Siliguri. I'm okay with all that. All right? But when you're writing about a community that hasn't been written about much, when you're writing about a region that hasn't received a lot of exposure in literature, you do come across a lot of pitfalls. Uh, you know, my novel Land Where I Flee is about an upper middle class Nepali Indian family that lives in Gangtok. Sumana gave it a glowing review. Thank you for that. But there were so many reviews, ladies and gentlemen, that were incredulous about the fact that a Nepali Indian family could be upper middle class. You should have seen, you should have read the disbelief in their sentences when they exclaimed, "This is not about a Nepali striving. This is not about a Nepali who works as a cook in someone's house. This is actually about a Nepali-speaking family that speaks in English at home, where one of the characters works in Manhattan." There is a lot of ignorance there. But there is also the pressure of representing a community when the community, which hasn't been written about much, expects you to be their mouthpiece. It's a double-edged sword. It's immensely frustrating, Neelima. The number of people who have written to me saying, "How is it that you have decided to wash our dirty linen in public? How is it that you've written about the one thing, about women being quarantined in cowsheds when they're undergoing menstruation? How is it that you've written about that for a Western audience?" So I keep saying, as a writer, I am a fiction writer. I'm not a public relations brochure of my community. Just as there are wonderful people in the Nepali-speaking world, in the Northeast, in Siliguri, in all these places, there are villains, there are bad people, there are evil people, and so on and so forth. As a fiction writer, the characters in my book do not represent a community, a people, a religion. They only represent themselves. And, it's immensely frustrating that people like Sumana and I have to constantly talk about this instead of, say, talking about the craft of writing. Again, Sumana and I've talked about this before, so I'm not going to be repetitive, but I hope that answers your question in a twisted, long-winded way. Yeah.
Yes, it does, Prajwal. That brings me to what you were saying, actually, that how is it to write for the international audience, about what you write on? Is there any kind of difference in the way it has been read What you were saying about the craft, is there a difference in the craft, or is it the same, or is it received in a different way?
It's something I struggle with on a daily basis. When I first wrote my collection of short stories, The Gurkha's Daughter, I had no clue who would read me. I didn't know if I would be published at all. I didn't know there would be a white Midwestern woman in Minneapolis reading me. I knew nothing. So you see a profusion of Nepali words in The Gurkha's Daughter. Okay? People have often come to me and told me, oh, there are at least 5 Nepali words on every page of The Gurkha's Daughter. Were you looking to alienate the Western reader? And I said, no, I'm unapologetic about my use of The Gurkha's Daughter. That being said, before The Gurkha's Daughter came out in America, there was this big debate I had with my publishers where they insisted on a glossary. Why? Because it's America. Go figure. The book was published everywhere else in the English-speaking world. It survived without a glossary, but in America, it needed a glossary. And I'm fine with that. I was extremely opposed to the idea in the beginning, but I will continue having a profusion of Nepali-speaking words in my book, because if you can have French words, if you can have German words, why not Nepali words? I have tried maintaining a balance. I have tried adopting the middle path by sometimes contextualizing Nepali, words like momos and sale roti. But I'm also afraid that that sort of takes my South Asian reader for granted. In the way the books have been received, we talked about Sumana doing away with in missing, which I think is extremely brave, because I was first published in England. I sort of succumbed to the pressures of my British publisher. I mean, the title of my book is Gurkha''S daughter. I mean, that's a very anglicized spelling for the word Gorkha, which was actually spelled Gorkha. But I guess these are some things that you do. There are so many battles that you have to fight, so you let go of others. Sumana, I'm interested in.
I think I'd like to respond to what Neelima said first, which is about the form, the craft. Because this is a panel about the relationship between writing and place, I think it's slightly lame to put us together and not ask, whether there is a Northeast aesthetic at all. I mean, just because we come from the same place doesn't mean we write the same stories. One of the ways in which Prajwal tried to kind of subvert writing about the Northeast is to put happy stories in his novel, for instance, that he wasn't celebrating bad news, not making a career out of it. To respond to, does one write for an international audience? I don't think one is thinking of the writer at the moment of composition. One is only thinking about the relationship between words at that moment. Having said that, I want to say that I'm very grateful to have found a publisher like David Davidar at Aleph. First, for the first book he published, which is How I Became a Tree, as you know. It's not a mainstream book at all. To write about plant life the way I did, and for him to respond the way he did, just shows how much a publisher can do for. We talk about underrepresented voices. It's not only underrepresented in terms of place, but also in terms of subject. Until then, I don't think there were too many books or any at all about plant life. The other thing which he mentioned about Gurkha's daughter, and this being G-U-R instead of G-O-R, I think the in-house style policy at Aleph is not to put Indian words in quotes or italicize them. And I'm very grateful to my publisher for that too. Simply because when we hear these words on the street, they don't come to us in quotation marks. Why should that be in the text of a book?
Thank you, both of you. That was wonderful, really. Now, the other thing which comes to mind while reading your books is role of social relationships. What role do they play in telling the story, in cluttering the message, sort of? Again, I understand as a writer also that you may not be doing it consciously, definitely not. But is it something which facilitates, is it much harder, I guess, to unbundle these concepts which we talk about, if they were just to be talked about as concepts, which would be a more academic exercise. But when you put them in the lives of ordinary people, I'll give you an example. When you talk about poverty or unemployment, and which is what I in this research is to follow a particular family which is going through a particular phase of poverty or distress over a period of time. So in a way, I had what was an academic research into kind of a social research. So how does that work when in your books, when you are looking at how to construct, how to articulate, how to place various messages when you are moving forward in writing it?
I'll try to answer this the best I can, because I'm not sure I understood your question very correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong, please, Neelima. Um, One of the things that does not interest me is writing about social relationships, actually. Uh, it might come from my being a very asocial person. I also think of the form of the novel, and I find it ironical, in a very humorous way, of course, that the first novel in English wasn't about social relationships. Robinson Crusoe is on an island by himself, and and it's ironical I say this because it was feeding a readership who wanted, which created, the novel the novel reading community came from the middle class. It was the new construction of the middle class in England and in Europe at that point of time. I'll sing from time. Yeah. I don't think so. Yeah, yeah, it is. But it keeps.
Hey,
Yeah, yeah. Uh, but having said that, I completely get your point. For instance, one of the reasons for writing this novel was to be able to record the changing character of my hometown, Shiliguri. How was I to do this? And people in Calcutta too and elsewhere would always tell me how lucky you are to live in a place like Shiliguri, by which they meant that I am in the, quote unquote in the midst of nature, as Prajwal said, as if I was living inside a travel brochure. We are not. In March, I must remind you that in March last year, Shiliguri was the most polluted town or city in India. Um, so it looks very good and beautiful from a distance, but it wasn't that what I wanted to record. Um, how was I to write about this town? I could not keep mentioning the Kanchenjunga and the beautiful, trees and plant life on every page. So the only way I could do this was through conversations. So as you might have noticed in Missing, I was recording conversations from different classes of society, by which I mean different socioeconomic classes, of course, and show that how this town has become a receptacle of migrants and languages which are also in migration.
You know, hi, can you hear me? We talked about Kanchenjunga. Yeah, perhaps I've only used 3 sentences in my book to describe the Kanchenjunga, one of which is, she liked watching the mountain change hue, because I am sick and tired of this gross expectation on a writer from the Himalayan foothills to describe. I mean, I find descriptive writing extremely dull. I know there are some writers out there who do a phenomenal job of it. I am not one of them. I mean, even McEwen can describe a blade of grass for 3 pages, but, I couldn't do it. And, Neelima, for me, I write fiction with the primary purpose of telling a story. I do not write it to shine light on the Nepali Indian experience or the Bhutanese refugee experience. Or the Kanchenjunga, for that matter. I write fiction to tell a story, and if along the way my fiction does some good, I will not distance myself from it. I will embrace it. But, I'm not writing these stories. I'm not writing a novel to chronicle this great movement of the Nepalis to India, or something along those lines. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but it does beg a question that is this an incidental thing, what it does to the community you're writing about or the subject you're writing about, that what you are doing is different, obviously, from what you had planned to do, or rather what happens later. But is it an incidental impact the kind of your writing has in, as I was saying, the mainstreaming of these issues?
Sure. I may have been among the first people to write about the Bhutanese refugee situation. So just to give you a little idea, 106,000 Nepali-speaking people have been kicked out of Bhutan because they were, because they were not Bhutanese enough to be Bhutanese, and their ancestors had been gone out of Nepal for too long for them to be Nepalese. So these people languished in a state of statelessness for close to 2 decades on the India-Nepal border, very close to where Sumana is from. And thanks to the generosity of America, Australia, and a few Western countries, they've all been resettled in Western countries, which is all good until you read about the fact that the suicide rate among newly settled Bhutanese refugees now is the highest amongst all immigrants in the U.S. Okay, all good stuff. Yeah, sure, but. If I wanted to write about this particular issue with the intention of letting the entire world know just how badly my people have been treated, subjugated, or corralled out, I'll use nonfiction to do it. Does that make sense? I mean, I like my stories to be about people. I mean, we could go on a whole debate about the personal being the political and so on and so forth. I don't think this is the platform for it, but I will still continue writing stories with, I will still continue writing fiction with the primary intention of telling a story, with the primary intention of entertaining, with the primary intention of transporting people into this imaginary world.
Can I add to that, please? I think is this working now? I think one of the your question points to something akin to guilt in the fiction writer, and certainly in the non-fiction writer, because when Robinson Crusoe is
Low, 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 low. Low, low.
This is the other India responding. Uh, I've forgotten what I was saying. Yeah, so when Robinson Crusoe writes his story, he's also representing Friday, knowing that Friday would not be able to read what is being written about him. It's one of the questions about a writer's ethics that marks particularly the non-fiction writer. It's one that I thought about a lot, particularly because I was writing about real life people, people with whom I continue to have very happy and pleasant relationships. Then it struck me that the Bimolda in the novel is not the Bimolda that I know. And I have no burden to bear, no burden of guilt to bear in representing him. This is completely different. And for this, again, I'm grateful to my editor, David Davidar, who made this point to me right at the very beginning after reading the first draft.
I have an interesting take on that. So after 4 years of following farmer suicide families, so obviously they had changed and they had evolved a little in some ways and sometimes quite much. And what was interesting was that where I began researching and where I ended up writing, as you correctly say, they were different people. So I discovered that I just could not put in the text what they were and what they had become with my own perception of them. So one of the methodologies I had evolved in the book, my recent book, Widows of Vidarbha, is to actually read the finalized text which I had translated and written back to them, obviously again translated and read out to them, so that they could, it was a kind of a peer review, if you will, where they checked whether I got the story right or not. And in some places, it was quite funny that they themselves discovered what they were saying, let's say 2 years or 3 years back in the research as funny. And they said, did I say that? I mean, did I say I won't marry? And now I'm like married. So those things also happened. But it was very informative for me as a writer, and especially as a non-fiction writer. What are the limits of representation? How does the dynamic work? Am I ever going to be able to 100% represent them? Possibly not. One of the main vehicles of representation, language, is the main hurdle of representation. So that's where the problem is there. It is where it is stuck. But having said that, I was also aware of how my own perception of the individual or the situation was different from what their perception was. This was especially there when I was talking about distress. When I was talking about a situation of, let's say, a farm widow. So when she is answering a question, there are a lot of silences. These are narratives of silences, more than language. So the interpretation made was so important, so central to this entire narrative, that if I had got that wrong, that was not something which I could definitely live with. So when I was reading them back, there were corrections which I understood happened only because of the kind of inadequate understanding of those silences where they were speaking about, or rather not speaking about, their experiences in. So that's the, it's not actually guilt, I would say. It was more in terms of a kind of a feeling of looking for some way to make sure that me as an author, as Foucault says, me as an author disappears from the scheme of things and dissolves, so that I can actually talk in the voices of these men and women and children. And I hope I have managed it, because as I said, that entire book is peer reviewed by 18 widows and their children. So, anything to add? Yeah, sorry.
I think representation, or the responsibility of representation, is a kind of anthropologizing the novel. It's a pressure that came to the novel after the Second World War. I think most of us came to writing for pleasure, and if we are employees, we are employees of pleasure. That is all we want to give.
And let me also add something to that. If you talk about the burden of representation, you represent a certain character a certain way, you may be accused of not being authentic enough. And then you decide to write him a different way, and then you'll be accused of exoticizing the character. So there's no winning here at all, which is why I think these topics about burdens of representation should be restricted to literature classes and lit fests. I don't think writers should think too much about them when they're writing their books.
Not literature classes, sociology.
Okay, sociology classes. There you go. Thank you so much.
Also, I think it's difficult, especially when you're writing fiction about entirely imaginary people, to do that kind of representative test. I think because the person or persons do not exist. So I would now ask Sumana if it's possible to read from your book, Missing.
So I'm reading, this is a book set over 7 days, from the 24th of July 2012 to the 31st of July 2012. I'm reading from 25th July 2012, a very short excerpt from the beginning. I'm reading this particularly because it's called Off Center, and I find a kind of moral responsibility to represent Shiliguri, as it were. Melancholy affects one's posture first. The gait. It hurt Bimolda's eyes to see the violence of words turn his most precious one into this slouched shape of sadness. So, when the auto rickshaw arrived and Tushi found herself a seat by the window, her face turned towards the wind, it was a relief. How different we are, he thought to himself, my daughter's daughter and my daughter's father, me. She's looking out to the world rushing by. I only see the people beside me. The auto rickshaw was a moving city, a population living with the inevitability of a tire puncture. Once, only the rich wore watches, only their time was precious. Now wire hung from his co-passengers' ears. Sound was a boomerang they played games with. It was a disease, Bimolda almost whispered to himself, this dependence on sound, as if it were food. Words, words, words. The world better go deaf. The auto rickshaw, this loud-mouthed fuming vehicle, would carry him to the blind poet. It was time for Bimolda to be grateful again. All through the day, his fingers touched his lips in prayer, like a thirsty man who's been told where the well was. It is good that the man's wife was called Kobita, he thought again. Poetry is, after all, an invisible thing, the same to the blind and those with torches for eyes. The driver's helper shouted. Some stop was near. Bhalobasha more! That loud voice ferried Bimolda back to where his body was. These were all new names, he noted with the discomfort of a man who'd been told that he would have to spend the rest of his life in tight underwear. The old must go. Names, people, furniture. He was grateful again that furniture was not immortal. He would have found mortality much before then, he, a penniless carpenter. Tushi, though, was elsewhere, concealing her nervousness with abrupt displays of confidence. Everyone was innocent until the question paper arrived. Tushi had known this as a student. She wanted to know why that thought was coming to her now. Was there no difference at all between being a student and an employee? Airview more, the boy went again. Tushi knew the meaning of these English words, air and view. She thought of the owner of the hotel who had given the place this name and laughed. Surely he must have been illiterate, for how can one view air? The auto rickshaw was eating up everyone and everything in its way. The Mahananda and the bridge over it, Anandalok, the new nursing home to the left, the market set up by Bangladeshi immigrants, the Tenzing Norgay bus terminus. The distance had grown as the stops had increased. Suddenly the driver stopped. Isn't this your stop? He asked. Bimolda smiled, the apology of an older generation. This was too little for the helper. Are you blind or are you a poet? The words came in Bangla, of course, the mother tongue, where hurt always strikes deepest. This was a new people, a new Bengal, a new Bangla. People have forgotten how to love with it. Poet is a word of abuse. Bimolda counted the change. The fares gone up. The world only knew how to increase in numbers, it seems. Price, cost, age. Bimolda called out to the helper boy like he always did. Have I left my umbrella in your auto? The boy pretended not to hear, or there were other sounds. This, Bimolda learnt early in life. A man without an umbrella was the poorest man in the world. The sky was man's greatest enemy, even wilder and more ferocious than land. Man must carry armor to protect himself. The umbrella must travel with him. He smiled at the cinema hall Bishwadip standing opposite him. Many years ago, he'd built the wooden seats here. A kirtan just wouldn't leave his head. He pushed it out of himself with his tongue, as if it were a sticky chewing gum. I'm not reading the kirtan. The song was slow to leave. So many auto rickshaws sped past it. Someday, he would like to measure speed like only a carpenter can, an instrument to measure which traveled faster, his feet or his song. Thank you.
Prajwal, why don't you read a short piece from your book, Gurkha's Daughter, right?
I'm reading from The Immigrants, the last story in the Gurkha's Daughter. It's also the best reviewed story. I think it reads like a B-grade Bollywood movie, but I won't get into that. So anyway, at this point in the book, the main character has just encountered a woman in a momo shop, okay? This was interesting. It's not every day that you came across an American who knew about momos. When I told people I was of Nepalese origin, they instinctively asked me if I had climbed Mount Everest. When I answered no, I hadn't climbed Mount Everest, and no, I did not know anyone who had, they were disappointed. When I mentioned I was from Darjeeling, most people asked me a tea question. When I let them know I couldn't distinguish one variety from another and that I didn't drink tea, they looked bewildered. And if I told anyone I was an Indian with Nepalese origins, they looked at me in wide-eyed wonder, sometimes pressing me to volunteer information about this curious mishmash. I wouldn't have minded recounting my family history so much if the inevitable, so you're half Nepalese, half Indian question didn't come up. Sometimes I drew a map and went through a spiel on the difference between ethnicity and nationality. Most other times, I just stayed silent and let people continue living in their bubbles. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumana. Thank you, Prajwal. May I now read from my book? It's not a novel, but I have employed the description of a novel, which I have the experience of doing in the earlier 3 books, which were novels, to write a research-based academic work. This book is called Widows of Vidarbha. They are widows of farmer suicides, which have happened in India. And this chapter is called Death Amid Doubt and Denial. This takes place in a district of Maharashtra. It's called Yavatmal, and the name of the village is Akpuri. So it's as I said, it's a different narrative from what's been talked about by both of you. For the state, The life of the farmer has always been a gray area, with few legitimate supporting witnesses or documents. As it intervened rarely in his life, the state was left with little knowledge about the farmer after his death. So when the state had to establish farmer suicides, it developed extensive paperwork to investigate the claims made by farmers' families and friends. Elaborate statements were recorded on lines of an inquest to ascertain whether the farmer had committed suicide owing to unpaid farm debt or other reasons. It was the duty of state representatives to follow procedure and provide compensation as relief to the bereaved family. And yet, the claims were examined as if the dead farmer had been guilty of cheating unless proven innocent, especially if he was poor and unable to repay debts. At the heart of this attitude of the state representatives was a dismissal of democracy and the belief that policy of relief was mere populism designed for votes. That would also partially explain the state's negligence to connect with farmers until they were forced to. This battle between the faceless state and the faceless poor went on until someone came along to represent the truth. Such a person made the paperwork redundant and questioned the basis of the mistrust, elitism, and entitlement that the state displayed. 65-year-old Janardhan Raut, this is the farmer who committed suicide, represented the truth of the farmers, dead and alive, and all those who suffered, not just in that particular district, but throughout the country. Janardhan, a farmer, visited the collectorate to meet the district collector on 24th of March 2014, that's where the case is from. Before he left his house, he informed his family that he would request for some relief for the consecutive crop failures in his 2-acre field, which was the main source of livelihood for his family. The family saw him leave in the morning from his home in Yavatmal's Akpuri village and expected him to return with a positive response. Instead, they received the news that Janardhan had consumed poison and attempted suicide. He was rushed to the government hospital where he died 22 days later. This incident again brought the issue of farmer suicides out of the grey and made the state confront it. And yet, it took 2 months and 2 days for the state administration to decree, in the manner of patrons, that it had recognized Janardhan's death as an eligible suicide and that his wife would be compensated with a relief of 1 lakh. It would appear that the state's suspicion of the poor had been so institutionalized that it could not believe in them even if the state itself was the witness. I mean, mind you, this farmer had killed himself inside the state premises, yet they would not register it as a suicide. This sense of denial could not be more established than when the district administration's farmer suicide wing repeatedly wrote letters summarizing Janardhan's death and that he had committed suicide on the premises. Despite that, there was no investigation about why he committed suicide, even when the family stated he had not planned to kill himself. The state machinery could not have been more directly complicit in the case and more conspicuously involved, but it was starkly evident that the state would remain guiltless, like a silent but partisan observer of a game. Thank you. So, may I take some questions if you have any, the audience, for Sumana, Prajwal? Volunteers, please provide the mic to the audience.
Since the theme of this panel was writing the real India, there's this book I had read by Leela Gandhi, I think, on post-colonial theory, which talked about how a nation is really something that exists in the political imagination of a people, which perhaps couldn't be any more true in the context of the Indian nation, which is so hugely disparate and heterogeneous. So, keeping that in mind, it's a two-part question that what is this unified reality of India that you might believe in and aim to write, if you do believe in one? And secondly, if you do so, then how do you go about the process of reconciling the differences between these sort of disparate elements that you're constantly being confronted with? Because we're not a homogeneous community at all.
I don't think I wake up feeling like an Indian. Neither do I wake up feeling like a woman, for instance. I'm not conscious of my gender, my identities. Um, because you mentioned post colonial theory, I think one of the grand failures of post colonial theory has been its inability to locate or understand micropowers within societies themselves. Um, the disparate realities that you talk about, as you know better than I do, being, I'm guessing, a student of this particular tradition of literature, that even if the nation hadn't come to be as powerful as it is today, these disparate realities would exist. So it depends, as a writer, which of these disparate realities concerns us.
Exactly what you said. Yeah. It's a great question, though. Yeah, I echo everything Sumana says. Neelima?
And I also like the part about reconciling different realities in what a writer actually puts down on the pages. I think that's, as Sumana says, totally agree with her. It's not a conscious decision, but it does happen that because you have rooted your experience in a particular reality, it has the ability of absorbing its own flavor and also probably the layers which are next to it. Thank you for the question. Any other question from the audience?
Okay, it's working. I had a question for you, ma'am, actually. So, when you were talking about farmer suicides, I remember this article I'd read recently about how the march that happens the march that happens every year. The article was essentially about how there's the ecological impact which has actually led to the farmer situation getting even worse, because I feel like environment is something we don't really give any attention to at all. When we think of ourselves as individuals, we'll think about ourselves our psychology, our physiology, our culture, it's so many things, but not the environment we exist in. So when you talk about the state being completely blind to the plight of the farmer, which we all know about, and we don't. I feel that I'm very passionate about, that we don't give any attention to the environment at all when it's in such a dire condition, and how we don't pay any attention to the environment at all when it is the immediate cause for why the farmers are facing such a dire situation. We don't know about droughts that happen. We don't know about why the crops fail. I mean, we don't need to know as well, but it's general awareness is required, isn't it? So I don't know how to phrase my question, but essentially, green politics hasn't come to India yet, and it's so important, and I don't know how to phrase it, but,
no, but
yeah.
I get the point. What you're trying to say, that environment has to play a
Yeah.
central role if we are especially thinking of rural distress and the impact on the poor. Absolutely. But that is also one of the problems of the state. Now, you have to make the awareness, that level of advocacy, that level of information has to be available, which is not there on the ground. The other important thing is that agriculture is a market-driven industry, right? So environment, in my experience, has always been a victim of the market. So when the choice is between, let's say, making a industrial unit and cutting down trees for it, or keeping the trees so that you don't, I mean, we all know which way that debate is going to go. in the same way, when farmers are incentivized to use certain inputs, chemicals, which you and I eat eventually, and we keep wondering why are we losing our health. So at the heart of that is this debate that why do these chemicals get into the soil? It's because of the markets, the MNCs which are behind the fertilizers, the seeds. These are not the kind of crops they should be growing. That's one of the reasons for the farmer suicides, because these are not crops suited for the Indian terrain where they are grown. But even after, there have been 3 lakh farmer suicides in the last 20 years, according to government statistics, which are always low. And even after that, we still ask this question, why do farmers commit suicide? The governments keep asking these questions, when they very well know why. They are the ones who made the policy. So, to answer your question, thank you.
You mentioned, this question wasn't directed to me, but I feel very emotionally involved and invested in this question because of my relationship with plant life. I think when we talk about the environment, when we talk about green politics, it is so anthropocentric, so based on man's greed, that unless we escape from this particular bind, we will not be able to ask the right questions. So even when we talk about farmers' suicides, not that the fact of man's death, is first and centermost in our minds. The fact of a philosopher like Matthew Hall saying that most of us are plant blind, in the sense that when you go back home, you'll probably remember that Prajwal wore a black t-shirt, but you will not remember that there were trees in the background and what the nature and character of these trees were. We are plant blind. We don't have any plant rights in India. The only country with plant rights in the world is Bolivia. And even then, these are very difficult to implement. It's very difficult to mention plant rights without thinking of the question of agency, because of course it would have to come from us. But even then, there is no raw law or even rules in this direction at all. I'm sorry I kind of put myself in this situation.
Any other question, please? Yeah. Okay.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Afternoon. Good
Neelima ma'am, this is a question, comment, as well as a question for you.
Sure.
While I'm sitting over here and listening to the farmer plight, it gives me a very deep sense of responsibility. And I feel I have been very irresponsible as a citizen, and not thinking about, though we read these news of farmer suicide, it just crosses our eyes that they are doing, but we never get into why these people are doing, what is the, we know the reason, but our responsibility is not there. So ma'am, the question is that, and I really appreciate and applaud you for this, bringing this to the public right over here. Some sort of consciousness has awakened. So like ma'am, the question is that we reap the benefits, but we are not paying our responsibility. So ma'am, do you think that are we also responsible for the conditions that is prevailing?
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful question. Very sensitive, very well thought out. I think that everyone is responsible. I think we are all responsible for the person next to us. The lines between, as I was saying, the lines between people are imaginary, and they are created by those who want to homogenize us, those who want to rule us. But there are no lines between us. There are no lines between, for instance, you and me. We are the same. And ideally, that's how it should be, that if something were to happen which was untoward to any of the citizens of this country, we should all be responsible. Therefore, we should all be able to find a remedy for this. But I think those who hold power in democracy would like to argue that that's why we have representative democracy in place, so that you don't have to necessarily get into a situation and find the solutions yourself. They would also go to the extent of saying that probably you won't understand the problems of, let's say, what a farmer goes through. You know, the issues of his income are maybe financial in nature. Maybe you won't understand it as a citizen, but I beg to differ. I think that if you wanted to understand what the distress was for a farmer, it is easily possible to do it. Now, having said that, why do we have to, I mean, in terms of citizens, why do citizens have to step in, even in a democracy, to do this? Because I do not think this country is entirely a democracy. I think it's half a democracy, which does not represent all of us. It does not represent all its problems. And that's why it's so important that citizens must take up the issues, including the solutions of what can actually help the poor or the farmers, women. There are so many divisions. There is as we all know, these divisions are manipulated. So we should try to go out of those kind of traps and try to find solutions, despite the fact that we live in a democracy. But thank you so much for the question. Thank you. Any other question? Yeah. Well then, thank you so much for being a very responsive audience and participating in this wonderful session. Thank you, Sumana, for your insights, and Prajwal. Thank you. Thank you.
I think the idea of a nation being a discursive construction is really epitomized by the Indian nation, because we are far from a homogeneous slaughter community, which is why it becomes so very important for us to have writers who dare to think and write off center and sort of relocate centers of cultural hegemony on power. So thank you so much for being here with us today, all three of you. It was great having you. So this will be followed by book signing sessions with all three of our panelists by the Oxford Bookstore Corner. We'll have sessions with Neelima ma'am and Ruchira Gupta ma'am, who just completed a session first, followed by sessions with Prajwal sir and Sumana ma'am. So please be sure to join them there. And we will be starting with our next session very shortly. Thank you so much.